The Wyoming wilderness in winter was a world stripped bare of mercy. The wind moved low and mournful across the land, bending the pines until they groaned like old timbers. The river lay locked beneath a sheet of ice, its black depths hidden, its voice silenced. A hawk circled above, its shadow sweeping across the endless snow as though time itself had stopped. Only one cabin broke the stillness, a small, sturdy thing of hand-hewn logs and stone, pressed close to the bend of the frozen river. Smoke drifted upward from its chimney, a thin gray line against the white sky. Inside, Elias Boone sat at the wooden table, sharpening a knife with slow, even strokes. He was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered, quiet as a grave. His beard was dark with silver at the edges, his eyes a gray that caught every flicker of the firelight without reflection. The world had tried to break him once, and maybe it had. But what was left, what had survived, was something heavier than iron, something made of silence and endurance. He didn't talk much, even to his wife. But Clara Boone didn't need words to understand him. She moved about the cabin, tending a pot that simmered over the fire. Steam rose with the smell of venison and herbs, carrying the comfort of home into a place the map forgot. Her face was gentle, her hair pulled into a loose braid the color of wheat under sunlight. When she smiled, it softened even the winter air. Elias glanced at her as she stirred the stew. The faint sound of her humming mingled with the hiss of firewood and the distant moan of the wind outside. To a stranger, she might have seemed too fragile for such a land, but that would have been a fool's mistake. The same quiet strength that kept the river frozen ran in her veins. It was her warmth that had tamed the wilderness inside him, the wildness that once made him a man other men feared. Elias Boone had come to the frontier after the war ended, when the fields of the South were still littered with ghosts. Nobody in the Wyoming Territory knew exactly where he came from. Some said he'd been a Union scout who saw too much killing. Others swore he was a Confederate deserter who vanished rather than hang. The truth was buried deep inside him, sealed behind that stone-heavy silence he carried everywhere. All anyone knew for sure was that when he first appeared along the Snake River, he built a cabin where the land met the ice and took no trouble from anyone. His days began before dawn. He'd head out with a rifle across his back and a sled in tow, following the riverbanks to check the traps he'd set for beavers and muskrats. His hands were rough from the cold and from years of labor, hands that could skin an elk in minutes or fell a pine tree with one swing of an axe. At night, when the wolves began to sing, he'd sit by the fire sharpening his tools or carving wood into shapes no one would ever see. Clara would read from an old Bible her mother gave her, her voice soft in the dim light. It was a quiet life, but it was theirs. A life far away from men, from the noise of gunfire and greed. But even in places the world forgets, its poison finds a way in. 2 days' ride south, in the small town of Dry Creek, the saloon was loud with the usual misery, laughter that came from the throat, not the heart. Men crowded around the bar, snow melting from their boots and dripping onto the floorboards. Whiskey sloshed in glasses, cards slapped against wood. Behind the bar, old Ben Colley kept pouring drinks with a hand that shook slightly from the cold. At the far table sat a man named Vern Calhoun. He was tall, lean, and mean to the bone, the kind of man who smiled only when he saw pain. His coat was black and dusted with snow, and his eyes carried that restless, hungry light of someone always looking for something to ruin. 3 men sat with him, drifters like himself, hard and ragged from the trail. "Hell of a winter," one of them muttered, pulling off his gloves. "Winter's a test," Vern said, lighting a cigarette. "Separates the weak from the ones who deserve to live." He exhaled smoke through a grin that never reached his eyes. The men laughed, though none of them seemed sure why. Behind the bar, Ben Colley wiped a glass and said, "Ain't all bad, boys. Heard some traders up from the North Country. Say the pelts are thick this year. Plenty of beaver along the Snake." Vern's gaze shifted. "North Country, huh? That's the river country?" "Far north," the barkeep nodded. "Past the canyon trail. Ain't much there but trees and snow. Just one fella lives out that way, big trapper named Boone." "Boone," Vern repeated, leaning back in his chair. "What's he like?" The barkeep hesitated. "Quiet. Keeps to himself. Don't come to town often." Vern grinned, sensing weakness in the old man's voice. "Then how you know he's even real?" Ben shrugged. "I sold furs to a trader who swore he'd seen him. Said the man's a giant, near 7 feet if he's an inch. And his wife." He stopped, realizing he'd said too much. Vern's grin widened. "His wife what?" The barkeep looked down at his rag. "Prettiest woman north of the Platte, they say. Kind face, soft-spoken. Some say she nursed a wounded soldier back to life once and married him soon after." Vern laughed softly, the kind of laugh that didn't sound human. "Prettiest woman north of the Platte, out there all alone?" The other outlaws exchanged looks. One said, "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "I'm thinking a man like that don't deserve to have something so fine," Vern said, his grin fading into something darker. "World's unfair that way. Some folks get too much peace." Ben Cawley's hand shook harder now. "Leave it be, Calhoun. You don't bother nobody. You go up there. You'll wish you hadn't." Vern stood, tossing a coin onto the counter. "You worry too much, old man. I'm just curious, that's all." He turned to his men. "Saddle up tomorrow. We'll ride north. See if the stories hold true." When the gang left, silence fell heavy over the saloon. Ben watched them go through the frost-fogged window, their horses vanishing into the storm that rolled down from the mountains. He whispered to himself, "God help you fools." By dawn, the snow had stopped. The sun broke weakly through the clouds, painting the world in pale light. The trail north wound through frozen valleys and pine forests, where even the birds held their breath. The men rode single file, their laughter echoing faintly off the canyon walls. Back at the Boone cabin, the day began like any other. Elias stood by the river, resetting his traps while the ice cracked beneath his boots. His breath misted in the air as he worked. The wilderness seemed endless, a place untouched by sin. Yet as he looked up toward the horizon, he felt something different in the air, something he couldn't name. He turned toward the cabin, where smoke rose steady and true from the chimney. Clara was inside, hanging linens to dry, humming that same tune he'd come to love. He smiled faintly and went back to work. But miles away, the wind shifted. It carried laughter, the cruel kind that had no place in this land, and with it came the scent of trouble riding hard from the south. The sun dipped behind the peaks early that evening, casting long shadows across the frozen earth. A wolf howled, then another answered, until the valley seemed to tremble with their cries. The air grew colder, sharper, as if the mountains themselves sensed what was coming. And through the darkening sky, a storm began to gather, not of snow, but of men. Snow fell in soft, heavy silence, each flake spinning through the air like ash from some unseen fire. The wilderness around the Boone cabin lay frozen beneath a low gray sky, the kind of sky that promised a storm by nightfall. Clara Boone stood near the hearth, stirring stew in the iron pot, humming quietly to herself. The warmth of the fire brushed her face, while outside the world was locked in cold stillness. Elias had left at dawn to check his traps along the canyon creek. He'd be gone till evening, maybe later if the ice was thick. The day felt longer than usual. The cabin's walls creaked with the shifting wind, and now and then, the distant cry of a crow cut through the silence. Clara glanced at the window, seeing nothing but the white glare of daylight on snow. Still, her hands hesitated for just a moment over the pot, as though some part of her sensed a shadow moving beyond what the eye could see. She pushed the thought aside and reached for a tin plate when the sound came, soft at first, like the rhythmic pulse of something far away. Horses. Her heart skipped. Out here, visitors were rare, and those who came unannounced rarely brought good tidings. The sound grew clearer, a group, moving fast. Clara's eyes darted to the wall, where the Winchester rifle hung above the doorway. She took it down with shaking hands, checked the chamber, and slipped behind the table, her breath tight in her chest. The hoofbeats stopped just outside. For a long moment, the world was still. Then came a man's voice, drawling and careless. Well now, this must be the place. The door swung open without a knock. For men filled the threshold, shadows against the pale light. Snow dusted their coats, their spurs jingled with each step. The tallest, dark hair, cruel smile, was Vern Calhoun. His eyes moved over the room slowly, possessively, until they found Clara, standing rigid by the fire. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, tilting his hat with mock politeness. "Hope we're not intruding. Just looking to warm our bones." Clara held the rifle firm, the barrel glinting in the firelight. "You are intruding. My husband's not far. You'd best be gone before he—" Vern laughed, a sharp, cutting sound. "Your husband, huh? You mean that big mute fellow folks whisper about down in Dry Creek? The one who hides up here like a ghost?" He stepped closer, his boots leaving wet marks on the floor. "Funny thing, a man like that, living in all this peace. Don't seem fair, does it, boys?" The others snickered, spreading out like wolves circling prey. One kicked at a chair, another leaned to spit in the corner. Clara steadied her aim, finger trembling on the trigger. "I said leave." Vern's gaze hardened. "Now that ain't very hospitable." His hand shot out quicker than thought. He slapped the rifle aside, and it clattered to the floor. Clara gasped, stumbling backward as the men burst into laughter. "Easy there, sweetheart," Vern said, his voice low and poisonous. "We ain't here for your husband's traps. We just want a little company." They pushed deeper into the cabin, their presence swallowing the room. One grabbed a jar from the shelf, sniffed the contents, and threw it against the wall. Another yanked open a drawer, scattering spoons across the floorboards. Vern took a seat at the table, boots propped up, grinning. "Pour us some whiskey, darling. You must have something to drink out here in the cold." Clara didn't move. The smell of smoke thickened from the hearth. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. "We don't keep whiskey," she said softly. Vern's grin faltered. "That's so." He stood again, towering over her. "You must be lying." He stepped closer until she could smell the sweat and tobacco on him. "Don't lie to me, Mrs. Boone." When she didn't answer, he grabbed her wrist. Pain shot up her arm. She twisted, struck him hard across the face. The slap echoed through the cabin. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Vern's eyes went black with rage. He backhanded her, so hard she fell to the floor, the world spinning. "Bad idea," he said, his voice cold as ice. The men laughed and hooped, overturning furniture, smashing jars. One fired a shot into the wall for fun, splintering wood beside the window. Another found Clara's bread tin and flung it into the fire. The smell of burning dough filled the room. Vern crouched down beside her, running a thumb along her cheek. "Your husband ain't here to save you, lady. Maybe he should have stayed in town where men got spines." She stared at him through a blur of tears and blood, her breath ragged. Then her hand found the iron poker by the hearth. She gripped it tight and swung with every ounce of strength left in her. The blow landed square across Vern's jaw with a crack like thunder. He roared and fell sideways, blood spilling from his mouth. The laughter stopped. One of the outlaws lunged for her, and she turned, swinging again, catching him across the shoulder. He screamed. The others drew their guns, faces twisting with fury. "Enough!" Vern spat, clutching his jaw. "Don't kill her. Let her remember." One of them kicked her ribs, hard enough to make her choke. The world dimmed at the edges. They left her lying in the wreckage, the firelight flickering over their faces as they stepped out into the snow. Vern paused at the doorway, wiping blood from his lip. "Tell your ghost of a husband," he said, his voice low and cruel, "that the West don't belong to the dead." Then they mounted their horses and rode away, laughter trailing behind them like smoke. When the last sound of hooves faded, silence fell again, a silence heavier than before. The cabin lay broken, dishes shattered, chairs overturned, the stew spilled across the floor. The rifle lay half buried in ash near the hearth. Clara lay still for a long time before she managed to pull herself upright, gasping with pain. Her lip was split, her eye already swelling shut. She crawled toward the door and pushed it closed against the wind, her breath trembling in the cold air. Outside, the snow swallowed every trace of the men's tracks. The sky was turning red as the sun sank behind the ridges. Far down the canyon trail, Elias Boone was finishing his work. He knelt beside a frozen stream, setting the last trap of the day. A raven croaked from a pine branch above him, its cry sharp and uneasy. He looked up, frowning. The air smelled strange, wood smoke, faint but sour, carried on the wind. He packed his gear and started home. The light was fading fast, the kind of dusk that seemed to erase the world. His boots crunched in the snow as he followed the river's bend toward the cabin. When he crested the final ridge, he saw the smoke, not the thin gray of a steady hearth, but the thick black coil of something gone wrong. A coldness gripped him that had nothing to do with the weather. He broke into a run. His breath came in harsh bursts as he crossed the frozen yard. The front door hung half open, one hinge broken. He stepped inside and froze. The cabin was in ruin. Shattered glass glittered like frost on the floor. The stew pot lay overturned, its contents congealed across the boards. A bullet hole gaped in the wall near the window. Then he saw her. Clara lay beside the hearth, one hand outstretched as though reaching for him. He dropped to his knees, his massive hands trembling as he lifted her head into his lap. She was breathing barely. Her skin was pale, her hair tangled with soot. When she saw him, her lips moved, but no sound came. "I'm here," he whispered. "It's all right. You're safe now." The night settled over the valley like a shroud, wind whispering through the pines, with a voice older than memory. Elias Boone stood in the doorway of the wrecked cabin, the fire behind him dying to embers. His shadow stretched long across the snow, and his breath steamed in the bitter air. He did not speak, did not weep. Grief had burned itself into something colder, harder, a silence that could kill. He moved with purpose now. From beneath the floorboards, he lifted an old oak chest, its surface scarred and blackened with age. He set it on the table and unlatched it. Inside lay relics of a life he had buried long ago. A long rifle with a walnut stock polished smooth from years of use, a Bowie knife whose blade still gleamed, and a hatchet with an iron head etched faintly by hand. He touched each as though greeting an old companion, his expression unreadable. He strapped the knife to his belt, slung the rifle across his back, and tied the hatchet at his side. Then he knelt by the bed. Clara lay still, her breathing shallow but steady. He brushed a lock of hair from her forehead. "You rest," he whispered. "I'll see it done." Outside, the snow had hardened into crust beneath the moonlight. Elias followed the trail where the outlaws had ridden. He didn't need a lantern. He could read the land by instinct. The faint print of hooves, the scuffed earth where a horse had stumbled, the faint stain where one man's nose had bled after Clara's blow. It was all there, plain as ink on paper. He moved swiftly through the night, a giant among the trees, his presence more shadow than flesh. Somewhere deep within, the part of him that had once been a soldier stirred awake. Years ago, before the cabin, before Clara, Elias Boone had been known by another name, Sergeant Elias Boone, Army Scout. He'd ridden with the frontier regiment that pushed west through hostile country, mapping rivers and hunting men. They said no tracker could match him. He could follow a trail over rock, through rain, across ground so hard it might as well have been glass. He'd earned a reputation for precision, and for a coldness that unsettled even the men who called him brother. He had seen too much killing, too much waste. Once in Montana Territory, he'd led a column into a canyon where a dozen native families hid. The orders had been simple: flush them out. But when the shooting started, something inside him cracked. He walked away from the war that day and never looked back. He laid down his rifle and swore he'd never hunt man or beast again. Now that vow lay broken beneath the blood-red sky of his home. By dawn, he had crossed 20 miles of rough country. The air grew drier, the snow thinning to dust. The land opened into canyons, deep, echoing, streaked with red rock and shadow. In the distance, a curl of smoke rose. The gang had made camp. Elias crouched behind a ridge, watching through the scope of his rifle. He counted 4 horses, 3 men visible, one asleep near the fire. Vern Calhoun was there, lounging on a rock, his injured jaw wrapped in a rag, his eyes scanning the horizon. Even from here, Elias could see the man's arrogance, the easy slouch of someone who'd never believed in consequences. Elias adjusted the rifle, breathing steady. He could have ended it then, one clean shot through the skull. But vengeance deserved no mercy of distance. He would come for them one by one, close enough to look them in the eye. He moved through the canyon with the patience of a wolf. The sun rose behind the peaks, painting the sky crimson. Dust drifted in lazy spirals as he slid from rock to rock, always silent, always watching. He found the last man on the perimeter, a thin outlaw with a scar down his cheek, standing guard half asleep. Elias crept behind him, rope in hand. When the wind rose, carrying grit and ash, he struck. The loop tightened around the man's neck before he could shout. Elias pulled him backward into the brush, the struggle short and brutal. A snap broke the dawn's silence. The body went still. Elias dragged him into a hollow and covered him with dust and snow. The others noticed nothing. They laughed and drank, passing a bottle around the fire. Vern bragged about his fight with the giant, slurring through his bandaged mouth. "Did you see her eyes?" he said to one of them. "She thought her man could save her. Guess she'll learn what kind of world this is." The others laughed, but the sound rang hollow. The second man, a wiry, nervous sort named Hatch, stood, scanning the canyon walls. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Feels like someone's watching." Vern scoffed. "Ain't nobody out here but us and the ghosts." But Elias Boone was already moving. He had circled around to the ridge above them, setting a snare along the narrow pass, where Hatch now walked to relieve himself. It was the same trap design he'd once used on wolves, a simple slipknot weighted by a rock, triggered by the slightest step. Hatch never saw it. His boot caught the rope. The rock dropped, tightening the loop around his ankle. He fell backward into a pit Elias had cleared beneath a deadfall, a dozen sharpened branches waiting. The scream echoed once, then was gone. The remaining two looked up, startled. "What the hell was that?" one shouted. Vern stood, hand on his gun, eyes darting toward the cliffs. "Spread out," he ordered. "Check the ridge." Elias melted back into the rocks. He could feel his pulse slowing, his breath steady. The wilderness was his ally now. Every gust of wind, every shifting stone, spoke to him. He could hear them moving, their spurs scraping against rock, their mutters turning to curses. The third outlaw came first, the one who tried to touch Clara. He moved carelessly, gun drawn, calling to the others. Elias waited until the man passed beneath a jut of stone, then dropped behind him, the Bowie knife flashing once in the morning light. The man fell without a sound, clutching his throat as crimson spread across the dust. Elias leaned close, his voice low as thunder. "You should have left her be." The man's eyes went wide, then empty. By midday, only Vern Calhoun remained. He was pacing the camp like a cornered animal, pistol in one hand, eyes wild. The wind howled through the canyon, lifting trails of dust that danced like spirits around him. "Boom!" Vern shouted into the emptiness. "You think you can scare me? You come out and face me, you coward." The name echoed off the walls, swallowed by silence. Elias stood atop the ridge, watching. His hatchet hung from his belt, rifle slung over one shoulder. The sunlight bled red across the sky, the kind of hue that looked more like fire than day. He stepped forward, his boots crunching the gravel, the sound carrying down the slope. Vern spun, gun raised. "There you are," he snarled. "You should have stayed gone, old man. The world forgot you for a reason." Elias didn't answer. He kept walking, his massive frame cutting through the dust like a specter. Each step was slow, deliberate. Vern fired. The bullet whined past Elias's head, sparking against stone. He didn't flinch. The second shot grazed his coat. He still kept coming. Vern's hand trembled now. "Stay back." Elias's voice came at last, deep and steady. "You hurt my wife." Vern fired again, empty click. He fumbled to reload, cursing, eyes wide. Elias was upon him before the next round chambered. The hatchet swung in a single, clean arc. The pistol dropped to the ground. Vern stumbled backward, a red line blooming across his shoulder. "You think you can kill me?" he gasped, clutching the wound. The storm came in from the north like a herd of ghosts, thunder rolling low through the mountains, lightning cutting the sky into jagged scars. Rain began to fall over the canyon, first as a whisper, then a roar. It ran down the red rock walls in black streaks, carrying mud and ash from the ridges above. The night was heavy, thick with the scent of rain and smoke. Vern Calhoun crouched near the dying campfire, his face gaunt beneath the brim of his hat. His shoulder throbbed where the giant's bullet had grazed him. Around him lay what was left of his gang. 2 dead, 1 dying, another staring into the fire as if trying to find his courage at the bottom of the flames. The canyon was their refuge now, a narrow gorge of rock and shadow. They thought the walls would keep him out, but the wind carried a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A crack of timber, a whisper of flame. One of the men looked up sharply. "You smell that?" Smoke drifted across the canyon floor, pale and curling. Another man stood, eyes wide. "He's burning the ends," he said. He's blocking us in." Vern's jaw tightened. He drew his pistol, checked the chamber. "Get the horses ready. We'll ride through." But when they reached the northern path, fire already climbed the canyon walls, dry brush catching in the wind, flames snapping upward like the fingers of hell. The rain hissed against it, but the blaze lived on, fed by the wind's fury. The men spun their horses back toward the South Pass, and found that one burning too. They were trapped. "Boone," Vern bellowed, his voice echoing between the cliffs. "You think you can smoke us out like rats? Come down and finish it." The only answer was the wind, and then, from somewhere within the swirling smoke, a voice rose low and steady. "You came to my home." The men froze. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, rolling through the canyon like thunder. "You touched what was mine," it said again. "Now the land will take you." One outlaw fired blindly into the haze. The shot cracked and vanished, swallowed by the rain. Another shouted, "He's just one man. One man." But his voice shook. Elias Boone moved through the smoke, without sound. His rifle rested against his shoulder, his eyes calm and unblinking. The firelight flickered across his face as he advanced through the shadows, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Each step was slow, deliberate, the movement of a man who'd hunted more than animals. The first outlaw never saw him. A single shot tore through the veil of rain, and the man fell backward into the fire, screaming once before the wind carried the sound away. "Where is he?" the second shouted, firing into the dark. The muzzle flash lit the canyon for an instant, enough for him to see a shape behind the flame, massive, silent. Another shot answered his. Then there was only the hiss of rain on stone. Vern gritted his teeth. He turned to the last man, the youngest of them, no more than 20. "Go up the rocks. Get a look." The boy shook his head. No, I ain't going up there." Vern grabbed him by the collar and shoved him toward the cliff. "Climb, damn you." The boy stumbled forward, trembling. He took 3 steps before a rope snapped tight around his ankle and dragged him off his feet. He screamed as he hit the ground, his body vanishing into the mist. The sound ended with a dull crack. The canyon fell silent again. Only the wind moaned through the narrow pass. Vern's breath came ragged. His eyes darted through the smoke. The firelight flickered against the wet stone, painting strange shapes in the dark. He turned in a slow circle, pistol raised. "Boone," he shouted. "Come on. You want me, here I am." Something moved behind him. He spun and fired. The bullet hit rock. Then a massive hand struck the gun from his grip, and he was thrown backward into the mud. The world spun. When he looked up, Elias Boone stood over him, hat gone, coat soaked through, the rain running down his beard in silver streaks. His eyes were the color of cold steel. Vern scrabbled for his knife. You don't know what you're doing," he stammered. "You'll hang for this." Elias didn't answer. He knelt, picked up the knife, turned it in his hand. "You came to my home," he said quietly. "You hurt her." Vern spat blood into the mud. "She ain't dead. You got your revenge. Let it go." Elias's jaw flexed. "You think this is revenge?" He swung. The fist hit like a sledgehammer. Vern went down, the breath leaving him in a wet grunt. He rolled and came up swinging, slashing with the knife. But Elias caught his wrist mid-swing and twisted until bone cracked. Vern screamed and lunged, driving his shoulder into Elias's chest. The 2 men crashed into the mud, rolling, grappling, the rain pouring down around them like judgment. The knife slid between them, each trying to force it into the other. Vern snarled, mud streaking his face. "You think you're some kind of hero, old man? You're just another killer. Worlds passed you by. Elias's strength surged. He wrenched the blade free and pressed it down. Forgotten men don't bury devils, he said, voice low and shaking. They erased them. Vern's hand clawed for the gun belt lying half buried in the mud. Elias pinned his arm and drove the knife into the earth beside his head, so close the steel grazed his cheek. Vern froze, his breath shuddering. The rain poured harder, washing the blood into rivulets across the ground. Elias leaned close, his face inches away. Now the West remembers. The knife came down once more. The echo rolled through the canyon like thunder. When it was done, the firelight flickered weaker, fading into embers. The smoke thinned. The rain began to ease. Elias stood alone amid the ruin, the bodies of the men scattered across the mud and stone. Lightning flashed once overhead, revealing the full breadth of what he had done. For a long time, he didn't move. Then he turned toward the North Pass, where the flames had died down. He walked through the ash and rain, his boots sinking deep into the soft earth. The storm followed him halfway home. By dawn, the valley lay under a veil of mist. The sky was pale and bruised, streaked with red where the sun tried to break through. Smoke still rose faintly from the canyon behind him, a black thread against the morning light. Elias reached the cabin just as the first birds began to stir. The door hung crooked on its hinges, but the fire within still glowed faintly. He stepped inside, the weight of his weapons heavy on his shoulders. Clara lay in bed, her face pale, but her eyes open. She turned toward him as he entered, her lips parting in a weak smile. "You came back," she whispered. He knelt beside her, setting his rifle aside. "I told you I would." She reached for his hand, her fingers fragile against his calloused palm. "It's over." He hesitated. Then softly, "Yes." Her eyes closed again, tears mingling with the faint smile that lingered on her lips. He stayed beside her as the sun rose over the valley, its light spilling across the snow and through the cabin's broken windows. Outside, the river cracked under the thaw, its voice returning to the land after the silence of winter. The air smelled of rain, smoke, and pine, the scent of life reclaiming what violence had taken. Elias sat there until the light reached her face, warming her skin. His hand never left hers. For the first time in years, he let his eyes close,